Hello, friends. It's Chapo. This is from the New York Times just yesterday. Its headline is "Meet the Voters Who Fueled New York's Seismic Tilt Toward the GOP." Republicans use doomsday-style ads to capitalize on suburban voters' fear of crime in New York, helping to flip enough seats to capture the House. And, we've talked about this before, but, the Times does give a sort of it paints a portrait of a lot of the Felix, as you described, the Mucinex monsters who chant crime, crime, crime. This is the Long Island, New York Republican, like the Lee Zeldin voter. And I just want to read a few things from here today. It says, New York and its suburbs may remain among the safest large communities in the country, yet amid a torrent of doomsday-style advertising and constant media headlines about rising crime and deteriorating public safety, suburban swing voters like Ms. Frankel helped drive a Republican rout that played a decisive role in tipping control of the House. One thing I'll say about that is, it played a role, but this is the New York Times covering New York State politics. The fact that it didn't mention Cuomo's redistricting of the state as a I don't know, like another factor in tipping control to the Republicans in the House is rather telling. But there's some good interviews with basically extras from Law and Order SVU here. It says here, several, including Ms. Frankel, said they frequently read the New York Post, which made Mr. Zeldin's candidacy for governor and the repeal of the state's 2019 bail law a crusade for more than a year, splashing violent crime across its front page, however rare they still may be. Many asked not to be identified by their full names out of fear of backlash from friends, colleagues, or even strangers who could identify them online. I wouldn't go into the city even if they paid me, a retired dental hygienist said as she mailed a letter in Oyster Bay. A 41-year-old lawyer from Rockville Center said she sometimes wondered if she would make it home at night alive. A financial advisor from North Salem in Westchester County said it felt like the worst days of the 1980s and 1990s had returned, despite the fact that crime rates remain a fraction of what they were then. I have kids who live in Manhattan, and every day I'm scared. Lisa Greco, an empty nester who voted all Republican, said as she waited at a nail salon in Pleasantville in Westchester. I don't want them taking the subways, but of course they do, she continued. I actually track them because I have to know every day that they're back home. Like, I don't want to keep texting them like, are you at work? Are you here?
Totally normal. Totally normal way to be. Just completely Julianne Morden safe, but for the news.
That is a completely regular relationship with the world and its dangers.
But the thing is, what the guy says in there is, it's like the 80s. Of course, you can nerdily say, actually, crime is much lower than it was in the 80s. But the thing is, in the 80s, people were processing like those crime rates in social conditions where they talked to other people in a day, where they had social relationships, like spent time in talking and interacting with other people. Hey, you hear about Steve getting mugged or whatever coming out the subway? That's that's the context for that crime. Now, even though crime is much lower, we've replaced that social interaction with internet, with media. Yeah. And so it's like all day your friends are telling you, hey, you hear about Steve getting pickpocketed? You hear about Dave, the knockout game? If you heard that, if that's all you heard in like 1982, you would go insane. You turn into the Punisher. If every person you talk to in a day talked to you about violent crime, instead of, the handful of conversations you might have in a week that kind of form your understanding of how bad crime is in when you were talking to real humans, you just get this klaxon nonstop. But it's the same social reality. What else are you supposed to compare it to? It's real to you. That is as bad as it is in New York.
Right. And I do think another small thing in that paragraph was interesting. How they talked about how they read the New York Post. These are presumably people who wouldn't have read the Post a lot otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Because the Post is like, I read the Post from time to time. Besides having hilarious headlines,
they got the best headlines in the game.
They're the best. They didn't use my suggestion for when Ron DeSantis won, which was going to be Christ fails to rise again. But great headlines. But it's also like it's if you want to read about crimes, that's the best paper in New York.
Oh yeah,
Crime
Central.
Well, I mean, the thing I noticed in this is that they're clearly like it's the New York Times, so they make sure to to mention, and I'm sure not inauthentically, that the New York Post is the paper of record for Long Island, crime heads out there. But I gotta say, it's pretty rich coming from the New York Times because, like, they spent the last year and a half pushing the exact same message, just with boring headlines for a liberal readership, not a conservative one.
Right. But I mean, okay, the New York Times does report on individual crimes, but like if you want like a crime blotter, you can read the New York Post. And my point was that, like, okay, in general, I do think that like a lot of the focus on crime is, as Matt said, a reflection of like media consumption conditions. And that, the feeling that crime is worse than ever is obviously a media creation. That said, it's still like not a non-existent problem.
No, it's a real phenomenon.
Right. It's a real thing that exists. And okay, like there has to be some way to talk about crime that isn't like either the New York Post, like get rid of the sickos thing, or the New York Times version of it where it's like get rid of the sickos but don't feel good doing it. There has to be some way where you can acknowledge that it's a reality that exists, where you're still not demanding that you put like 17-year-olds in prison for life for armed robbery.
Well, the problem is that even if you're the New York Times and you really are filled with that desire to honestly report what's going on with crime in the city, you actually have listened to Citations Needed, and you do want to make, like, you want to be honest, and you want to affirm the truth. You still are reporting things, right? You can report on individual crimes, or you can report on stories around crime. And in New York, the only stories around crime are Republicans saying it's out of control, and then Democrats saying it's out of control. What are you supposed to say as the New York Times? Those are the only polls. Where else is it?
Right.
Who else is acting in a way for them to shape the news around? That's it. Those are the two polls. And that's because the Democratic Party in New York is just awful, corrupt scumbag association. It's just Tammany Hall blown up, where they don't even have the fellow feeling because they don't hang around and smoke cigars anymore. They're all on Zoom calls with their babysitters.
A Tammany Hall, except no one gets a turkey every year.
Yeah.
Right. And there's no, like, if those are your only options, there is no policy beyond like, oh, we're going to give like more money to cops without even any requirements for where it goes, what type of training. They're just going to buy Israeli military runoff or, something even worse. I mean, there is no policy because okay, if you look at not like, oh, there's more sickos on the subway or whatever like that. Like if you look at like crime in Chicago or crime in like Memphis, crime in places that did have like a huge spike in murders, very localized to like specific neighborhoods in 2020. There's like no real policy that you can actually do that would permanently or at least meaningfully impact anything besides like a massive reorganization of society and its resources.
Yes.
And it would take years and years and probably decades because the conditions there are a reflection of that, like a fundamentally broken society and people who interpret, and correctly so, that they're at war.
Yes. And the same way that they can't address it without undermining, the conditions that create crime, they also can't address the conditions that create the thing that a lot of people, especially people who live in cities as opposed to in suburbs, are actually upset about, which is visible poverty.
Yes.
Right.
Also load bearing, also non-negotiable.
Right. And I also feel like your point about New York City, though, and like visible poverty, I think another huge thing that I and many other people have noticed about like the people's perception of crime being out of control is all of the complaints that like everywhere in New York City smells like weed now.
Yeah.
Which is legal.
New York is always
which is legal,
bad.
but like I got news for you. It smelled like weed before it was legal.
New York has always smelled like something bad.
Yeah,
always.
It's like, I'm so pissed it smells like weed here. It's really covering up the urine. I would much rather be smelling that. Get out of here.
Right. And okay, like to that end, visible poverty. There's no acknowledgement that these are two separate issues. These are two separate types of crime.
Right.
There is the actual murder spike that happened, and then there is the complaints about crime in places like New York and LA, which at the end of the day is mostly just complaining that you see homeless people.
Because the spike in murder The spike in murder happened everywhere.
Right.
And the spike in murder is worse in rural areas than it is in urban areas as ratios. And like there's cities like Jacksonville, Florida, which are completely controlled by Republicans that have vastly higher crime rates than any of these coastal cities. But
well, Jacksonville has like it has a murder problem that is identical to some neighborhoods in Chicago and some places in New York and some like it's the same thing. It's the same type of thing where if you took out all of these neighborhoods, they would be places. They're all almost all to the exact place, like places that used to be like solidly middle class or like working like lower middle class places that were pretty safe, good places to live. Deindustrialization happens.
Yep.
The mass degradation of Americans happen. The destruction of the safety net, everything happens, and they are as they are now. But like, you know, these are like crime is generalized as a singular issue, but those are two completely separate things.
I'd like to segue into an issue that I think very much informs this conversation in terms of people's media consumption and people's perceptions about the world at large.